All right, everyone. Welcome back to Quick Coffee, another episode. We're super excited to be here together with Ned. We have a special guest today, and I'm very excited about him having on the show and talking a little bit about the early days at Lovable.
Yeah, super excited to be here. And I this is fun because I think we have these quick coffee chats in real life all the time. And so just an excuse to record one and broadcast one as well, I guess, which I assume is how the show started as well, actually, which would be one question.
I was just about to say, Pat, also good to have you here.
Yeah.
And that's how the podcast started back in the days. Like Pat and I, we used to build a travel company together, and we used to always have those coffee chats about how can we improve the app? How can we think about design and product? And then at some point, we just started recording our kind of one-on-one meetings, and it turned into a podcast. And it's kind of fun because that's now been quite some years, 8 years ago that Mapify was founded, right? 2016.
Yeah, 16, 17, and then the podcast is now close to 3 years. So it's really been a while. I mean, on and off, of course, it's always been somewhat of a side project for us. But I get surprised, the interesting thing is in a podcast format, which is why it's something that we like to do. It's really a very personal way, right? Usually there's some story that you discover. There's more content than a quick post on a platform, for example. And so we actually regularly meet quite some people that have listened to Quick Coffee here and there for quite a while. And so they then know quite a big part of the journey, which is why it's super cool to have you on and ideally, learn a bit about your journey. And I think maybe the simplest way to kick it off is, obviously there's a time before Lovable and then there's Lovable, right? And I can imagine, that time frame of Lovable feels like a couple of years before that, comprised into like a short amount of time. But maybe you can just kick it off quickly. How did you end up getting to Lovable? How did it all start out? And maybe a couple of interesting anecdotes from that time, and then we'll dive in.
Yeah, sure. So, I basically stumbled across both Anton and Fabian very circumstantially. ChatGPT had exploded. I've had this sort of feeling that AI was going to reinvent computing, and that as a designer, we'd have this new material that we'd be able to work with. And so, actually, at the time, I was working on a lot of design work for public sector. And so, the startup where I was leading design, we were quite well adopted by governments, 3-letter agencies, stuff like this. And we had to do all this work around meeting accessibility guidelines and stuff like that. And so it would be things like, okay, the French government uses French government blue, and we're going to customize this app for the French government. Like, how do we do that and also meet all these really, really strict standards? And all of the work was kind of academically interesting, but kind of boring, if I'm honest. It was like lots of like plumbing and no real like invention. It was like, let's tick the box in a way that makes us happy rather than let's invent something that's never existed before. And so I actually started building little utilities for myself to kind of see what AI was good and bad at. And so one would take a brand color and then it would develop a color scale from the brand color. And actually one thing that was really fun was also I made one that would take a still from a movie and then create a color palette based on the movie. And so you could be like, have like a Wes Anderson themed mobile app or like the Matrix themed app and things like this. And so I started to build these little tools for myself because I was like, I wonder if AI is good at this basically or not. And then I realized that I was completely out of my depth. And so like, I'm a designer. I can hack things together because I always have hacked things together, but I'm absolutely not an engineer. But anyway, those explorations led me to some of Anton's open source work. And then I reached out to Anton. And it's funny, actually, when I first reached out to Anton and then spoke to Fabian, I actually thought that they were like scammers in some way because they had like, Anton had like some Twitter followers at the time and he had some posts that went viral. But he also had this GitHub project that had like 50,000 stars or something. But even just the README on the project was like very badly written. And then you'd go to the website and the website would be using a different domain, but then referencing something else. And then I'd email them and then they'd reply from a different email address. And I'd be like, who are these people? And so I basically reached out to them. And then if by chance, completely in parallel, they were looking for a design leader in Stockholm. And they were struggling to find a design leader who had a high technical aptitude as well. And that's basically where I've always indexed. And so it was just a really good fit on both sides.
Super interesting.
How was the first conversation, after you reached out? Were you like immediately like sold, or was it like, I'm going to think about that?
I can maybe tell a story that I don't think I've ever told before publicly, but I had a couple of conversations, mostly with Fabian actually. And there was one point where I actually dropped out of the conversation. And I basically said to Fabian, like, look, I think we've been talking a little bit and I think you're looking for somebody who's going to come in and grind like 100 hours a week and they're going to kill themselves over this. And I really like you and I really like the product. I really like the vision. However, my like partner is pregnant. We're expecting this year. I've grinded for like, I can almost count in decades now rather than years. It's been a long time. I think you need someone like younger who's going to kill themselves. And Fabian said, yep, we do. Like, that's who we're looking for. And so like I had that conversation with him and then basically slept on it. And then he reached out the next day as well, basically saying like, hey, can you reconsider? And then at that point, I basically said to myself, well, might as well meet everyone in person, because it just feels like there's something here, but there just wasn't enough to get a real feel from like an ad hoc phone call here and there. And then after I met everyone in person, basically it felt like a no-brainer to go all in, basically. So yeah, there was definitely a sliding doors moment where like life or paths could have been very, very different.
Super interesting. I mean, that's really, usually there's some interesting storyline, right, happen in something that is so unique, I think, in your life now, of course, with this project and company. Something that I've wondered actually since we met for the first time, when you joined, was there already like a design idea, like a design vision that originated from the initial GPT engineer? Like where was design at this point in time? Because of course today, millions of people have used the product, and it again has kind of been the inspiration for other products. And so you look at the UI and it kind of now feels very obvious, right? This is how it had to look. But then nothing usually that looks this obvious was that obvious in the beginning. So where was it even at that point in time? And it must have intrigued you to join this early. So something must have been there where you said, okay, this is something that I can work on. Even though, I mean, from what you now said, it was completely different from what you had done before, right? Which is also crazy.
Yeah, so what was completely unwavering, and this hasn't changed at all, was the vision. So I think there's two specific insights that, to Anton and Fabian's credit, they were extremely early on. So one insight was AI will probably just write all code in the world, if not like 99% of code in the world. And when we were talking, I was joining, like, that was non-obvious. If you said that to some quite respected engineering leaders as well, they might even laugh at you. They might say like, okay, well, Copilot is at the time was the most bleeding edge, and they might say Copilot is okay at this but really bad at that, and you still need people for that. And the future was quite fuzzy. But that unwavering conviction on like AI genuinely just going to write most code in the world, like that was there since day one. And so that was very compelling. And the other thing that was also unwavering was this realization that if that statement is true, then the most impactful way to shape this technology isn't making professional developers more productive. That's a local maximum. It's like, okay, a professional developer who maybe spends 3 or 4 hours out of the day actually coding, if they're 50%, even 200% more efficient, does it change the world? I mean, it changes the shapes of teams. It changes the profession, but it doesn't really, put this sort of ding in the universe compared to enabling non-developers to be able to build. And so like that was very concrete, even when the product didn't really have a shape. And so that was very compelling. But then to answer your like actual question, the product that existed at the time was essentially very simple. The homepage was actually kind of similar to what we have today. And so it was very much chat input and that's it. And we were very opinionated about not having any friction between your initial input and you getting something valuable out. So that never changed. But what has evolved quite a lot, I would say, is just like hundreds of macro decisions around, once you do that, what happens next? And we would go back and forth over even things like, should we show code or not? Or should we assume someone knows that it's even using code? Or is it an ideation tool to the point of, does it help you organize your thoughts before you start to think about what it is you want to build? Or do we let you ideate by building and giving you something tangible in front? And so it was like, there's lots of like small macro decisions across those dimensions where we explored a lot, and we like frankly got a lot of things like wrong as well. Like we built things, deleted, and then rebuilt. And like those are the things that changed rather than like the overall product shape, I'd say, or the overall vision.
Do you still remember, because I remember also when we met, there were, as you said, like many different decisions that were happening, right, in terms of like how the product would change over time. And I even remember the version where you would prompt something and then you would see Lovable basically writing the code, and you would be following the code and you would actually see that. And I actually remember lots of people got excited about that, especially in the early days. But that was also due because I think in the early days, also more technical people were using Lovable than today. But do you remember what was, like one of the things that made a big like impact or change that made also Lovable blow up? Looking at the different versions in the beginning, like, can you nail it down to like a specific decision that made a difference?
Yeah, so there's maybe like two things like that I could say here. So one is we were actually too early when we started. Like the models just weren't there yet. And the unlock that enabled Lovable to be able to even exist was when Anthropic came out with Claude Sonnet 3.5, which was last summer. And so prior to that summer, we were ideating and feeling things, and we could see that there was some kind of end game here, but the models just frankly weren't good enough. And we were like trying to build around the models. But there was definitely a pre and post moment once we got our hands on like Sonnet 3.5 that just completely enabled Lovable to be able to exist. And of course, like other models kind of caught up like soon after and so on, but that was definitely the unlock. And I could maybe describe some wrong turns that we took, actually. I'll come back to wrong turns in a second. And then after, to sort of answer your question, it's going to be a really unsatisfying answer, but the things that really made the difference were watching people and talking to them in a very unsophisticated way. And so what we didn't do, which I think a lot of AI teams do, is we didn't like instrument evals, and we didn't take this like data first approach and so on and so forth. We literally built things, dog fooded until we liked them, and then we gave it to people and we watched them. But we would, do the classic mom test thing of like hands off and watch them. And for me, the biggest signals were actually non-verbal. Like I felt confident to launch when people would steal my laptop from me when they'd see Lovable for like 5 seconds. Or I'd be on a call with somebody and something would happen, or they'd get their initial generation and their body language would change. They would literally like sit upright. And we started to look for those signals. And when we took more like kind of qualitative bets on these like softer non-verbal signals, that's when we started to really build momentum, like actually rather than like data driven, like quantitative and things like that.
I find this kind of unlock. I mean, this is also a very interesting point, right? In terms of like really going back to kind of the old school method of testing, literally speaking to your users and that kind of iteration. And it's actually, it's refreshing, and I think it should be an inspiration to everyone, listening, that ultimately, even the biggest companies in the world start out this way, right? Where they talk with like their first 5 users or 10 users. And that's just really amazing to see. When you talk about like this kind of unlock moment, right? I mean, this is something that now becomes incredibly crucial in the age of AI, where you build a company and there might be, a foundational model evolution missing for what you want to do. But how did that world kind of pre and post look like? Like you would have, like, I'm now imagining kind of the same interface as I know from Lovable today, and then I would just type something in and the output wouldn't be great. Like, was it that, or it didn't work at all? Like, where was the product when you kind of, I mean, you didn't know yet probably, that the new model would come out, and then, but there must have been this realization, okay, this is how the product looked before, and this is how it looks now. And then it apparently became clear very quickly, okay, this is now the model unlock moment for what we're trying to do here.
Yeah, so a couple of things were happening at the same time. And so one was we knew the limits of models. This is pre-Sonnet. And the limitations were either limiting in two different directions. They were either limiting in how impressive the generations were. And so if you asked for something like build me a landing page, build me a blog or whatever, it would feel like a very junior person's first attempt at one of these things. And like that was just unimpressive. It was like, okay, I kind of get it, but like it's not substantial. So there was that dimension. And the other dimension was actually across latency. And so we could make things more impressive, but that would come at a huge latency cost. And what we couldn't do is we couldn't come up with a good enough user experience to balance both of those things. Like nobody would sit for 5 minutes for something more impressive for a product they've never heard of, a product they've never touched, a promise they don't believe can be kept. And so we actually, like, once we started to make these breakthroughs and, we started to integrate with better models, like we also had to convince people that the product even existed. Like people would say, you have a wait list, therefore it's vaporware, like it doesn't even exist. And so it was trying to balance this, how substantial does the output feel? And does it come in quick enough that a new user can get this aha in enough time. Like that was the challenge, because if we wanted to have something substantial and impressive over like 20 minutes, we could have done it 6 to 9 months before, but that wouldn't have been this product of like where you feel like you're co-creating with AI. That would have been this product of you delegate to AI, which is just a completely different thing.
Interesting. I mean, it's kind of like when you think about that latency question, it comes down to like, okay, how short can it be for it to be a good user experience, right? And then the question is really, even if you would deliver the same result after 10 minutes, would it still be valid, right? It sounds like there would be a cutoff point, like whatever good the result is, it's just too much time that it would have taken.
100%. And I think there's something around like, I think about this in terms of, I can't remember who said it, but somebody described a brand as basically being like, it's like a bank balance, and you make a promise and you deliver on the promise and your balance goes up. And if you break the promise, your balance goes down. And so you have this sort of promise meter or like promise bank. And at the time, for like a bleeding edge AI product, people just weren't willing to like believe in these promises because it just felt too crazy. And so we had to deliver like immediate substantial value, like near instantly, in order for people to even want to engage beyond like the very, very first touch.
But that's what I find so exciting, also thinking about the first website, right? It's basically immediate value. Like the entire page was designed in a way that within a few seconds you would get immediate value. No marketing bullshit, no like scroll down to discover what we do. Basically, you load the page, there's one question for you, what are you building? You put it in and it starts building for you. And it makes so much sense, like what you just described in terms of like, you know, making people buy those like promises, or like shortening the gap between, you know, what we sell and the value you actually receive.
100%. And yeah, the other, like I maybe implied it earlier, but I think I was going to talk about wrong turns that we took as well. And so it actually comes back down to this latency thing. Like we actually thought we were being really smart because we would listen a lot to the foundation model providers. And so early last year, they basically said, look, agentic workflows are the future. You want to build your product to be ready for when agents are here. And I think with like a long-term view, there's like something in that, you know, we're still figuring out to today. But what that meant was that the product was really, really slow. And whenever new models would come out, they would be technically better at reasoning, but they'd also be like 5 to 6 times, they'd take 5 to 6 times longer. And again, that wouldn't enable a product with the same shape as Lovable. That enables like something more like, if you look at like OpenAI Codex, or more like Devin, or these kinds of products where you send something, you're happy to wait 20 minutes, 2 hours, you don't really care. And so like that was one of the learnings as well, that like we also can't trust the foundation model providers so much, because they're optimizing for different things. And like meanwhile, we had this very opinionated view on like what we wanted Lovable to be.
But that's interesting, right? So you can only control certain things thinking about building a company, especially in the age of AI, right? There's just things you can't control. So what is it you focus on and doubling down on? And then, yeah, maybe we can take a moment and also look at some of the earliest, like Lovable product UI, product screenshots, because I find it so interesting. When I look at those, I can see, you know, definitely a lot of parallels, you know, to our like actual current product in terms of layout and in terms of how you're navigating and like communicating with it, with the AI. So if you can like show and like walk us through some of the early designs, that would be actually quite
sure.
fun.
I'll share. So this is what's funny is it's actually very easy for me to show you, because my goal was like, I'm the only designer, I need to have the minimum amount of surface. And so actually the first launches, these were my designs basically. And so probably familiar. So at the time we were called GPT Engineer. And so you'd have a chat on the left and a preview on the right, which would be the majority of the screen. And then I would literally ask myself, like, what's the most efficient way to the minimum surface to sort of lay things out. And so a handful of context menus and popovers, again, for these actions over here, and then some kind of contextual messages. So, you know, some that are successful versus some that have errors, responses from the AI. And that was it basically, of like the very, very first product was like, okay, let's just build this. And I think like maybe like one of the reflections that I had like through this process was that when I first started working on this, of course, like building the interface felt like the first job to solve. It was like, okay, what's the size of the text box, or like things like that. But I like very quickly realized that that's not really designing AI. Like designing AI is figuring out like what are people's goals and ambitions, and what do they know about the world before they even know your product exists, versus like what are they capable of once they know it exists and they get it in their hands. And it was this was kind of the simple work of like just putting together the UI that enabled the product to exist. But meanwhile, like all of the grind was like, okay, when does the AI make assumptions versus when does the AI ask people for their more input, or things like that.
Looking at the layout, it's still the same as we have today, right? On the left hand side, we have the chat interface, and on the right hand side, we have the preview. Let's see how that evolves.
But I mean, you two sound like you know more than me on this one. But it's really cool. I mean, it's cool to see that this is where basically it's kind of like, this was kind of the invention moment a bit on, how it came about, right? A UI that today already, that's kind of only 1.5 years ago, basically, that now looks so incredibly familiar. But it's interesting to kind of hear you talk about, most of the things, most of the hard work or the questions being kind of behind the UI, right? And the UI in itself being quite quickly, quite straightforward when you have it figured out how to lay out it. Then it's like, okay, how, are people seeing code or not? That these are then the questions in terms of how you interact with an AI system. And that's quite interesting to hear about.
I think also what is so exciting is once the foundation is there, then you can just build on top of it, right? I kind of feel like the same happened with like thinking about our, like, for example, the operating system of Apple. There's still so many parallels and like similarities, comparing the new Mac OS to the one that was designed 10 years ago. We still have the top navigation. We still have the bottom dock. We still have, you click on something with your right click and the little menu pops up. And looking at this interface, I can just see, it's still the same foundation, but we've just, added more things or rearranged smaller things, but the foundation is still there. And it's just interesting that you don't necessarily need to reinvent everything in order to be successful. You just need to understand what works, right? And then make smaller adjustments.
100%. I think I maybe have some other things. I mean, maybe they're interesting, I'm not sure. But like this was like one of the early homepages that we shipped. So at the time we were co-branding actually. So the project was called GPT Engineer, and we were trying to figure out like, do we dual brand or do we not, or do we go all in? And so like, again, this is probably very familiar to if you use Lovable today, like we basically have the same thing. But it was very, like you can tell that we understood our audience less as well. The fact that we're like, I mean, I still kind of like this, to be honest, like this idea of like an AI software engineer for all of us. But it's very like, bloated and very, very fluffy at the same time. Humble beginnings.
But it's interesting, right? I mean, the gradient we still have today, just differently. The prompt suggestions we still have today, but a little differently. The prompt box we have still today, but even the logo we still have today, but a little differently. Do you want to show the first logo as well?
Yes, I mean, what was funny was, as we were in this transition, I was like, okay, we're going to transition from GPT Engineer to Lovable, but this is literally material symbol rounded, the heart icon, and that's it. And so it wasn't like ownable enough or claimable enough as a logo. So I was like, okay, let's just do something to like spritz it up a bit. And by the way, I would time box these things to like 20 minutes. I'd be like, I'm going to spend 20 minutes on the logo because I need to spend 200 hours on product or whatever. And so with the logo, I actually made this in 3D because I was curious about spline at the time, and placed some light objects behind and then made it illuminate from behind, basically. And so the idea here was that I was trying to play with this idea of a spectrum of color of like RGB. And then I also added blue and yellow as a nod to the Swedish flag, and then had those colors kind of rotate behind, basically with like a 3D fragment, and then having a light behind. And so this was very beloved as well by lots of people, which is quite sweet. But it was also a pain to work with because it was like no transparent background or like anything. It didn't really work.
So interesting. I mean, it's really cool to hear, about these anecdotes really, in terms of like, how it kind of got started and yeah, the evolution of what was an early interface in brand design. But it's interesting to hear you say, like, how did you think about like brand versus product in that moment? Like last time on the last episode, Felix and I were chatting about brand versus product and kind of this question of, what really matters today. Obviously, the Lovable brand now is incredibly well known. But when you say, I time boxed on the logo side, like, did you think really like, okay, we need to have some brand, we need to have some name, but ultimately it's going to be, coming down to the product? Like, how did you balance it out back then?
Yes, I gave myself like basically one goal with the brand. And so minimum viable brand for me was, when people see this, do they have an immediate gut reaction that the people who made it cared? And like that, like they cared about doing the thing that I'm looking at. And so all I cared about was provoking that gut reaction in anyone new, like seeing the brand for the first time. And that was the goal, because meanwhile, we had so much surface area and so many things to discover and so many things to try and fail at, that if we spent any more time than that, it would have been like a misuse of time for the maturity of what we were doing. And so it was genuinely like, can I create the sense that somebody cared? Yes. Next thing. And like that was the goal for the, like, I'm going to call it a prototype brand. And that enabled us to go to market. It enabled us to have a public waitlist, which you could then invite from, and those kinds of things. And that was it. But then as soon as we had something, like, it became very painful very quickly. Like frankly, we weren't expecting to be as successful as we were so quickly, to go have these completely unprecedented numbers. And so then it became a race to like, okay, we actually want to capitalize on this and have like build a very enduring brand. How do we do that? And so we had to immediately rebrand. And so I think there's like a trade-off there, where like there's an alternate timeline where we could have invested more in the brand up front, but that would have come at the opportunity cost of like working on the product. And I think we did the right thing actually. And we also had continuity between the brands, was also one of the other goals. So I think it worked out okay, but yeah, that's what I was optimizing for.
Interesting. Super interesting. I mean, it's really crazy, even, I mean, it kind of looks like you look at the history book at this point, right? And then it's only, it's only one and a half years ago. When you reflect on the time, maybe, that's one thing that I've wondered about a lot. When you reflect on the time, what's been the most surprising design learning where you had to change your mind about, or where you actually got surprised in the sense of like, okay, I really thought this would be different. And it turned out to be, you kind of, the users proved you wrong, or you had to learn something the hard way in terms of how to design for this new age of technology.
I think maybe what I was naive about was I assumed that UX was a solved problem, because I'd also spent roughly 6.5 to 7 years in messaging. And so I'd gone super deep in this idea of, human to human communication. And in my mind, I was like, my data points were, I understood messaging extremely well, extremely deeply, and empirically ChatGPT and similar products were finding good fit. And so I kind of thought that's the solved part, and we'd have to explore everywhere else. What really surprised me is that there's such a huge relationship between the user experience you're trying to curate, the models themselves, the models' own personalities and idiosyncrasies, and the user's context. All of these things are completely combined. Like, in order to build a really great product, you need to execute really well across all of these things. And so we spent way more time than I ever expected, in a good way. And I think this is a designer's job as well, on things like what is the AI's actual context versus what is the person's context, and how are we getting the most out of both of those. And so, if you look at the way that our AI works, it's like it's lots of small macro decisions, but it's like, when should the AI make an assumption because it's better to make an assumption and move forward, versus when should the AI ask the user for more input. And I actually think that's going to be more of the job of a designer as well moving forward. It's like figuring out everything around context. And I actually want designers and non-engineers to also own this word context more as well. Like right now it's an engineering term for like, what is the context window, or like, what is the amount of context that can be loaded. But like, actually the biggest piece of context is the user. It's like, what are the users' goals, their dreams, their desires? What do they understand? What don't they understand? Like, how do you empower them? And so, yeah, that surprised me.
Really interesting. That's really interesting. I've heard it, 95% in an engineering context at this point, right? But then obviously, what does the user have in their mind or heart, in terms of when they look at the product? And that's a big piece of context that has to be added to the equation, which especially when you think about the fact that now a human can basically in a completely human way interact with an AI, right? So then that entire context that someone has, kind of becomes a possible interaction way with the computer, which is really interesting.
And how do you design for context? That's like definitely something every designer and founder should be thinking about. Nice. All right. Wrapping it up here, Ned, thank you so much for joining for our like quick coffee chat, talking a little bit about the early days and even showing what Lovable looked like.
Cool.
When it all started, and having the comparison to like what it looks like today is just like incredible to kind of see the early days. So thank you so much for joining, and see you guys all next week or the week after at Quick Coffee.
Thank you so much for being on the show.
Cheers.